So Seth Rogen has a message for his fellow comedians.
Saying terrible things is bad. So if you said something terrible, then that's something you should confront in some way, shape, or form. I don't think that's cancel culture. That's you saying something terrible if that's what you've done.
Okay, so Ryan, this is actually an issue that I cover a lot. I'm culture editor at The Federalist, which entails covering a lot of comedy because it's a huge part of our culture. And what I think Seth Rogen is doing here is relying on a huge definition of terrible. Because not everybody who's canceled, I mean, that's really sort of the point of cancel culture, is that it's when people are sort of unfairly punished for something they said. And the term has become basically unusable at this point because it's so vague and murky, and it's been exploited by Republicans, it's been exploited by Democrats for political reasons. Now nobody has any idea what it means. But at its heart, what it was supposed to be getting at is people that were genuinely facing unfair punishments or consequences disproportionate to the crime. Maybe they said something bad a really, really long time ago that they've already apologized for. Maybe they said something that was just kind of anti-leftist, and then they lost a gig or they suffered professional repercussions, whatever it is. So I sort of think what he's saying is kind of an unfair interpretation of the term.
Well, I mean, most of what a lot of comedians say is terrible. Like if you pull it out of the context, I wouldn't repeat any of it.
Yeah.
Here, it's so right. Who's defining terrible? And on the left, people refer to it as holding people accountable.
Accountability culture.
For what? Right. It's not cancel culture. It's accountability culture. We should bookmark Seth Rogen saying that because at some point in the next couple years, he's going to be being held accountable, for something that he said, and he'll probably wind up with an apology, and then the question will be, well, what's his sentence? Is he gone, from touring and from comedy for a year, for 6 months, for 5 years, for 10 years? Can he never be heard from again? And people will throw back in his face, well, look. You said if you say something terrible, then that's bad, and you shouldn't say terrible things. And then he'll say, well, I'm sorry I said the terrible thing, but here's the context in which I meant it, and I was actually trying to subvert the terrible thing that the phenomenon is describing. And so, I think you're right. It's just a cop-out from confronting the actual question.
Well, and here's what really gets me angry is that this is so easy for a multi-millionaire, successful comedian to sit back and say, well, if you say something terrible, you should be held accountable for it, when there are people who legitimately working people who need their next paycheck, who are having to keep their opinions quiet or let their kids learn nonsense or, let someone get away with saying something in a conversation about critical race theory, for instance, that's actually they find legitimately racist or offensive. And we can't have these conversations in the country anymore because people who do depend on paychecks don't want to talk, and reasonably so, because some of them actually have been hit with wildly unfair repercussions, even if it is just this intense and disproportionate stigma in their neighborhood or problems at the PTA or with other people on the soccer team. This actually has caused a lot of friction in this country, and so it's easy for Seth Rogen to kick back and say, yeah, hold people accountable for terrible things they say. But there are actually real people in this country suffering real consequences for saying some things that aren't so terrible and getting no grace simply for sort of, not towing the leftist line or the cultural leftist line. And that's what makes me, I think, most upset about all of this.
And the best comedians are kind of born knowing what's funny,
yes.
but they even make mistakes. That's why the best comedians do so many private shows in underground clubs where they're trying out new material before they bring it onto the big stage, into their HBO special, because sometimes something that they think is incredibly funny just doesn't land with other people, and you need to test that out. And something that sounds offensive loses that offense the funnier it is. But if it doesn't land and it's not funny, then you just said something gross and offensive.
I love that.
Without intending necessarily to say something terrible.
And that's such a good point, because now those comedians aren't able to even do those experiments because everybody has a smartphone and starts tweeting everything that's on social media, or they put out a video, and you can't even have these experiments to find out where the line is. Nobody's arguing there should be no line, because then you just have this sort of moral anarchy, and that's not helpful to anybody. But that is such a good point that, when you can't even find out where the line is, we're never going to have a line anymore.
Right, and and finding out where the line would be synonymous in another industry to figuring out what's right about a particular path forward. Whether it's an epidemiology or something else, that you have to be able to throw out ideas and have them be wrong in order to be corrected. Otherwise, somebody won't throw out an idea that turns out to be right because they're afraid of what the repercussions are going to be.
Right. No, it's completely true. It's just sort of like the marketplace. You need to let things flourish so that we can actually figure out what's right and what's wrong, and that there can be competition of ideas so that things, when they're debated out in the open, society can say, wait a second, that's really wrong. This product is really bad. This intellectual product is really bad. And when you lose the ability to do that, we're just all shutting up and we're not having good conversations.
And there's always been accountability.
Yes.
It just has to be proportionate. Like in the past, you told a really bad joke. You did pay a price for that. But now the proportions are all off, and he's not addressing that at all in his defense there.
Our cultural ecosystem is so out of whack. Like in a healthy cultural ecosystem, you have comedians and then you have the sort of like conservative religious people who hyperventilate over the comedians. And now we have these like leftist idiots who are hyperventilating over the comedians, and the comedians are apologizing for it instead of just saying, what the hell, I'm a comedian, I'm not going to apologize. So the ecosystem, I think, as a whole is out of whack, and I don't know how we get back to it.
Tipper Gore won.
Yes, Tipper Gore won. Victory for Tipper Gore.
More rising for you after this.